Hello, good morning. Welcome to this week's episode of Learn with Lorna, episode number 225, where we are looking at some of the stories from Inverness Harbour's history. My name is Lorna McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. We have 4 archive centres in the Highlands of Scotland, in Inverness, Fort William, Portree and Wick, where we look after historic records relating to the Highlands of Scotland. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there is no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work and support us in continuing to do all the different things that we do, then we are really grateful for that. So welcome to this week's episode. This week, again, is pre-recorded because Jamie, my colleague in Nucleus, the Caithness archivist, and I are down in Ipswich for the English launch of the Following the Fish project. I know that many of you have been looking at the online exhibition and also visiting the physical exhibition that we have in Caithness at the moment. The Following the Fish project resulted in 2 touring exhibitions, the same content, one touring Highlands and Islands and one touring Norfolk and Suffolk, as well as the online exhibition. And the tour of the English content that's going around Norfolk and Suffolk is starting at Ipswich at the Hold, the home of the Suffolk Archives, in the next few days. And Jamie and I will be at that this evening, so that's why this is pre-recorded. But it seems appropriate that even though it's pre-recorded, we are looking at a harbour and looking at stories of ships. So here are some stories from the history of Inverness Harbour over the years. I was surprised to find out that Inverness didn't have an official built harbour until the mid to late 1600s, although of course it had been used as a port for centuries before this, and there are records detailing its use as a place for ships to come into for hundreds of years. But it didn't have an official built and constructed purpose-built harbour. In his book Historic Inverness, A. Gerald Pollock wrote, "Until 1675, there was no regular harbour. Boats either beached on the banks of the river, or, if too large, on the beach of the Firth at the Longman. Cherryshot, just downstream of the Citadel, where the Ordnance Survey of 1868 shows a shipbuilding yard to have been, is thought to derive its name from the Gaelic word for a small boat or skiff, currach, and so it could mean that the place where the small ships beached. Just a little further downstream is Ship's Flat, where larger vessels grounded. Similarly, Scatgate, the old name for Rose Street, is usually taken as meaning Herring Way, the route by which the herring from boats beached at the Longman were brought into the town." So, using the banks of the river and using the beach at the Longman to berth ships or to bring ships ashore until an official harbour was built. So in the middle of the 17th century, the first quay in the harbour was built, using, according to tradition, stones from St Mary's Chapel. And according to Pollock, this first quay was built with the income from the shore dues, which was a tax granted to the burgesses in the Great Charter of 1591, and that was paid for by across subsequent centuries, including by the Inverness Harbour Trust to the District Council up to the 1980s, and possibly beyond. I don't know if that has continued. The construction of this first quay between Waterloo Bridge and the present railway viaduct cost around £300, which, when I had a look, works out at about £51,000 today. And its creation enabled vessels of up to 80 tonnes to use the harbour. So this was a huge development and a huge change. But, of course, the fact that it existed and the fact that it was used and utilised meant that it would inevitably need repair and extension. It's one of those vicious circles that now that it's built and operational, then it's getting usage and it's needing updated. And these changes came in the early decades of the 1700s. So let's turn to Margaret MacDougall, who reliably, of course, had researched the history of the harbour, and I found notes within the Margaret MacDougall collection about what happened next. Port facilities were inadequate to meet the trade of Inverness at the beginning of the 18th century. The passageway from the Murray Firth to the harbour via the River Ness was narrow and difficult to navigate. Stones and mud had accumulated on both sides of the river, and in part blocked the free passage of ships to the quay. The magistrates of the day realised that the harbour would require alterations and improvements if they were to continue to export to and import from foreign countries, as well as retain their large inland traffic. In 1719, the town was desperately in need of money. Revenue was low, and expenses incurred in repairing the churches, settling a new minister, and doing the day-to-day repairs on the harbour had put the town badly in debt. Only some extraordinary form of taxation would meet the deficit. The town council, after due consideration, applied to Parliament for an act to allow them to lay a duty of 2p Scots on every Scots pint of ale and beer vended, brewed, brought in, tapped or sold within the borough and its liberties. This duty was to be levied for 19 years, and it was anticipated that by the time the Act expired, the revenue therefrom would have paid off all outstanding debts and left a tidy balance for future eventualities. So we get to the point where this harbour that's been built in the mid-1600s is past its best. It needs expansion, it needs repair. And in the early decades of the 1700s, there's no money to do it in. So what do? They look at where they can tax something to raise revenue specifically for this purpose, for the repairing of churches and the repairing and extending of the harbour. And so they settle on this 2p Scots on every Scots pint of ale or beer that's sold or bought or tapped or brewed. They're covering all their bases within the borough and its liberties. Now, this tax was very unpopular, and it didn't make as much as the town council had expected it to. It did in the first year, but then subsequently it didn't. So if we go back to Meg's notes, we can see what happened next. The duty on the ale fell short of the town council's expectations. The council had gone ahead with a large-scale scheme for improving the harbour. They had deepened the channel, built new quays and erected bulwarks. When the 19 years was completed, the harbour, although still unfinished, had incurred a debt of some £2,790. So they've not made as much money as they wanted. They've gone ahead anyway, and the harbour is not finished, and they have got a debt of nearly £3,000 at the time, so it's substantial debt. The harbour could not be left as it was, and so the magistrates decided to apply to Parliament for an extension of the Act, which of course the tax should have only been for 19 years. In their petition to Parliament, it was pointed out that they had anticipated a greater revenue from the 2p on the pint tax, and had undertaken large-scale improvements which would benefit the trade and commerce of the town on that expectation. The decline in revenue they attributed to the townspeople drinking tea, rum and brandy instead of ale. They hinted that these drinks were cheaper than ale because they were smuggled and paid no excise duty. The tavern keepers and innkeepers were suspected of concealing stocks of ale and using every means in their power to outwit the collector of the ale tax. But the townspeople opposed the suggested extension. So they're saying, 19 years, we haven't raised all the money we wanted to, can we extend it? The townspeople opposed the suggested extension of the Act, considering it unfair to the poorer people whose main drink was ale and beer. Protests were sent to Parliament, but the town council had put up an almost unanswerable case. The result was that the Act continued for another 21 years, and although the revenue continued to fall off, the money collected did help to pay for the harbour and its improved facilities. So it's gone from being a 19-year temporary tax to being 40 years of this tax. And we hold records relating to the collection of that tax. Some of the money raised was used to buy land, to rent quarries, to build boats to carry stone, to deepen channels, and to build a new quay, the Citadel Quay. Construction happened right throughout the 1700s because of that delayed. It took longer than expected, the cost was higher than expected, the income was lower than expected, and so it's developed through the 1700s. And we hold a really extensive collection of documents from this time. Within the Inverness Borough papers, there are the public affairs, infrastructure and development papers, including numerous accounts. So if anyone is particularly interested in this, and I know always that there are people who are really interested in infrastructure projects, Then come and have a look through these accounts from the early 1700s. There are payments for ironworks, for tools, for materials, for labour, including names of labourers working on the project, records for masonry, for cleansing. So much information about this period in the early to mid 1700s when the Citadel Quay was being built. So it's interesting where you get, as always, where you get this different information. You can get information within the official records like those borough papers, but also within Margaret MacDougall, within other collections. And I found a document within our court papers, within our borough court papers, that gives an insight into life in the harbour in the 1700s. And this is not about the construction. This is just a wee side story that I came across, which I thought you might be interested in. This document is from 1761. And as usual, you'll have to bear with me because I haven't had time to transcribe it. So I'm reading it from the original 1761. 19th of December, 1761. Unto the Bailey, start that completely again, sorry. Unto the Constable, unto the Honourable William Hibbert, Provost of Inverness, the petition and information of Mr. Bailey, merchant in Tain, humbly sheweth that upon yesterday night, between the hours of 11 and 10 of the clock, or one or other of the hours of that night, William Taylor, residing in Wester Keswick, with several others of his company, did, in a most unlawful and unprecedented manner, come, with others, to the harbour or pier of Inverness, where the ship called the Mercury, your petitioner's property, now lies. So the person who's writing is saying that William Taylor and his accomplices came to the harbour where his ship, the Mercury, was at berth, and there began to cut, destroy, and carry away the cables, ropes, and rigging, in the actual act of which the said William Taylor and his associates were detected and were apprehended, and now lie incarcerated within your lordship's Tolbooth. So he goes on to petition for the fact that this has happened. He's writing about what's going to happen to this person, what's the sentence going to be. But it's just a great little insight into the drama that's happening in the harbour, because we can look at these records that talk about the construction, about the cost to the borough, cost to the town, what's happening, why is it needed, trade. But on the side, if you think out the box a little bit and look in other record types, you can find out something about the life happening. And there, for whatever reason, William Taylor is getting into the harbour, breaking onto that ship and cutting down all the ropes, rigging, cables and ties. It wasn't until the end of the 18th century that the next further significant work was carried out on the harbour. And in 1799, the anchorage and shore dues, which is money collected for goods landed and for goods shipped, these started to be let separately for the first time. And so in that first year, this new way of separating out the income brought in £96 for the borough, which now is around £9,340. So this is quite a substantial amount of money to come in to the borough. And the first statistical account published for Inverness in 1793 reads, "The harbour is safe and commodious and is kept in excellent repair. 7 vessels belong to it, measuring from 400 to 500 tons, and manned by about 30 seamen, including apprentices. They are chiefly employed in carrying to London the produce of our manufactures, the fish of our rivers, the skins of our goat, deer, roe, fox, hares, rabbits, and otters, and other articles. They bring in return materials both for use and for luxury. There are 9 boats manned by 6 men each." Really gives an idea of the extent to which the port and the shipping trade was central. I've spoken a lot about this over the years, the fact that we think in roads usually and in that road network of moving, but actually in the past, huge amount of transport and goods movement is happening via the coast. Traffic in and out of the harbour increased steadily, and by 1807 it was earning around £232 a year in dues, which works out now as about £18,000 a year. This increased traffic prompted a request to Parliament to levy the dues, both to extend the harbour and also to improve the existing infrastructure. So it's the same as we saw in the 1700s. What you've done in the 1600s has been successful, which then becomes its own, makes it necessary to do a repair and an improvement. And so the same things happened. The changes of the 1700s have been successful. And so in the 1800s, they write to Parliament to say, can we now again extend the harbour and improve what we've already got? And as a result of this, in 1808, an Act of Parliament received royal assent, which provided for, listen to this is completely extraordinary, I thought, what this act covered, this one act: building a bridge over the River Ness at Inverness, widening certain streets, improving the present harbour, extending the royalty, supplying the inhabitants with water, regulating the police, and lighting the streets. So one Act of Parliament covering all sorts of elements of life in the borough. And what I thought was interesting there, not aside from the breadth of subjects, was the reference there to regulating the police, because that's a very early reference to police as opposed to constables. It was this Act, the 1808 Act, which allowed for the deepening of the harbour, improvements to the Old Quay and the Citadel Quay, but also the construction of the Thornbush Quay, which was completed in 1817 under the supervision of Thomas Telford at a cost of £1,400, which works out at around about 102,000 today. Again, Telford, he's the most extraordinary contributor to Highland infrastructure. The construction of the Thornbush Quay allowed larger ships to berth in the harbour, which of course increased trade, and we see that quite quickly afterwards. So in 1817, we can see that there were 8 foreign ships and 955 domestic. And then by the year after, 1818, we have 25 foreign ships and 1,081 domestic. So that's quite a big uptick quite quickly. Within our Inverness Borough Public Affairs papers, within Infrastructure and Development, there are a large number of documents for this time as well. So again, if you're interested in this story, do come and have a wee look through them. Accounts, lists of men who were employed on the work, extracts of minutes about discussions of decisions taken at this time. Now, until the passing of that Act, the 1808 Act, the harbour and its revenues had been the exclusive property of the Town Council and had formed part of the common good. But after the 1808 Act, it became more complex. I wanted to share with you an extract from an article that my colleague Jamie, who is the coordinator for Ambala, he wrote this article a few years ago, and I wanted to turn to this to tell the next part of the story. The 1808 Act made it clear that dues levied from the original existing harbour were to be added to the common good and could be spent on any borough purpose, and that those levied from the new quay belonged to the harbour and could only be spent on further improving the harbour. The Town Council were appointed trustees and were charged with ensuring that this rule was adhered to. So it's very crisp and clear that the money made from existing stays with the common good. The new harbour extension, the new quay has been built. The money from that can only be returned into the harbour. And the Town Council given the authority as trustees to oversee this. However, instead of doing this, they spent the money borrowed for the new pier on improving the existing harbour, which they owned, thus ensuring that the increased revenues came to the borough and not, as the Act has intended, to the improvement of the harbour. From then until 1846, the whole cost of maintaining the old and new parts of the harbour was charged against the revenues of the new pier, and nothing was charged against the monies heading into the council's coffers. Inverness was severely in debt and close to bankruptcy for long periods of the first half of the 19th century. The Town Council's Finance Committee looked at selling all borough property that could be got rid of, including the old harbour, and were it not for resolute public opposition, this could well have happened. It was only the revenue generated, albeit against the terms of the Act of 1808, that kept the town afloat. The opening of the Caledonian Canal in 1822 threatened to dent the harbour's profitability. By the 1840s, larger vessels were unloading their cargoes at the Muirton Basin of the canal, and it became clear that significant improvements to the harbour were required. Realising that they, the town council, were unlikely to be entrusted with this responsibility, the town council applied to Parliament to establish a harbour trust to manage the harbour's affairs, and this was provided for by the Inverness Harbour Act of 1847. The trust was made up of 7 town councillors, including the provost, 5 shipowners, and 5 merchant traders, and they immediately set about extending the Thornbush Quay, building the Carnac and Capel Inch embankments, and deepening and widening the channel from the Keswick ferry upwards. Harbour dues more than doubled in the 20 years after the establishment of the trust. So, 2 things to take from that. 1, the challenges that are brought by competition. The fact that the Caledonian Canal is now up and running from 1822 onwards, and that brings challenges of competition. The Muirton Basin now exists in very close proximity, and what challenge does that bring? But the second thing, and the most important thing really out of that reading, is the establishment in 1847 of the Inverness Harbour Trust. We hold a large number of records for Inverness Harbour Trust, including minute books, estimates, correspondence, reports, legal documents, photographs, a large number of plans and illustrations, a really, really substantial and interesting collection. Let's return to Jamie's article and see what happened next, and also what was the next place of competition. So we've looked at the canal being established, but what comes next, you can probably guess. The coming of the railways to Inverness provided a whole new set of challenges. The Highland Railway constructed a harbour branch to Shore Street and laid rails along the quay to aid the transfer of goods from ship to train and vice versa. Both modes of transport profited until the railway was extended to the north and began to take business away from the steamers, which until then had had a virtual monopoly on transporting goods between Inverness and the northern ports. Shore dues fell steeply from the mid-1860s to the early 1880s, exactly at the time of the huge development of railway infrastructure in the Highlands. The harbour trustees gained parliamentary authority in 1883 to carry out further improvements which resulted in the annual dues almost doubling over the next 20 years. It was during this period that coal became a much more significant commodity, with larger steamers able to bring cargoes in from the ports of the northeast of England. Further improvements were carried out into the early 20th century, including the Thornbush Slipway in 1908, and these again served to boost the revenues being earned, mainly from petroleum products, cement and timber. Now, the development of the Thornbush Slipway allowed also, in addition to those boosting of revenues that Jamie referenced in that section there, the development of the Thornbush Slipway also allowed for the increase of ship repair and shipbuilding, albeit on a small scale. We are not talking about Glasgow here. This is a small shipbuilding industry. And Lorna viewers who have been with me for a long time might recall the role that the Thornbush Slipway would play in World War I as part of the work of the Rose Street Foundry. In 1985, coming much more up to date, in 1985, the 183 metre or 200 yard Longman Quay was built on land reclaimed on the east bank of the river. Jamie noted in his article that the Longman Quay, unlike any of the previous improvements, was paid for without recourse to borrowing. In 2008, the harbour underwent the biggest change in its history, with 8 hectares of land being reclaimed at the mouth of the River Ness to develop new port facilities, a new yachting marina with 150 berths, and additional business accommodation. The marina was opened in 2009 by Dame Ellen MacArthur. And Inverness Harbour today is still run by the Harbour Trust that was established in 1847. And they manage a weighbridge, storage areas, and 4 quays amongst other facilities. And the 4 quays that Inverness Harbour Trust manages today, or Port of Inverness manages today, are North Longman, Longman, North Citadel and South Citadel. So really nice to see that those names have carried through, some of them. It's a place of historic importance, but also a place of current importance. It's a place where countless journeys have started and finished. Countless cargoes have been loaded and unloaded, and multiple stories have started and finished within a harbour. I think I've possibly said to you before, we hold within our records the Customs and Excise collection. I've done a Learn with Lorna on the Customs and Excise records, and they list the ships that are based in Inverness Harbour. And I find those documents just really, really romantic with a small r. They really give an insight into journeys starting and finishing, and who was here and who was working in the harbour, and where were they heading for and what were they carrying. So hopefully between this episode, and if you go back and have a look at the Rose Street Foundry one that talks about the Thornbush Slipway, and also go back and have a look at the Customs and Excise episode, which will talk more about some of the ships that have been in and out of our ports. But hopefully between all of those, you've got a bit of a picture about the story of Inverness Harbour. Some fantastic records relating to it from within the Borough papers, within the fantastic Inverness Harbour Trust collection as well. So I hope you have enjoyed this episode, and I hope you can join me next week. Next week is the final episode before the summer break, and we'll be looking at the subject of building bridges and telling some of the stories of bridges across the Highlands and Islands. So I hope you can join me for that. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining me for this week. If you've got any comments, please do share them in the chat. When I return from my gallivanting in Ipswich for the Following the Fish launch, then I will pick those up. But in the meantime, a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we are really grateful for that. Thank you.